Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you from our studio in Washington, D.C. Is North American media, particularly television, fair when it comes to covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, not according to our guest today. Jhally is a professor of communication at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, founder, executive director of the Media Education Foundation, and was the director and producer of the film Peace, Propaganda, and The Promised Land. Thanks for joining us, Seth.
Welcome.
So your film essentially makes the case that North American media is one-sided, pro-Israel. Make the case.
Well, actually, I often say Israel is actually involved in two occupations. On the one hand, they're occupying Palestinian territory in Israel and Palestine, but they're also engaged in a second occupation, which is the occupation of the American mind. They have to make sure that Americans think in very, very specific and narrow ways about the conflict. And the reason for that is because Israel is dependent upon American aid for whatever policy it carries out, and therefore it has to make sure that public opinion is controlled and is broad and supports those policies.
So give us some examples.
For example, I mean, in the film we look at how the occupation is covered. And if you look at American news coverage of the occupation, you wouldn't even know there was an occupation going on.
Yeah, I know there was a study by the Glasgow Media Project which did a survey in the UK and the United States, and they asked the question, who's the occupiers of the occupied territories? And a majority of people said the Palestinians are the occupiers.
I did the same thing in my classes when I teach large lecture classes, and I ask people at a fairly liberal university, 18-year-olds, who is illegally occupying land in the Middle East, and again, the answer I got consistently between 58 and 65% was the Palestinians. And so that's one of the reasons I got interested in this topic, which was how can people come to have that kind of understanding of the situation? I mean, how do people understand something that is diametrically opposed to what reality is?
So give us some specific examples of, and who's doing any better?
Well, the specific examples are, FAIR did a study, actually, the Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, did a study of network news and found that only 4% of network news actually even mentioned the term occupation. So, for example, if you were to watch footage of the occupied territories, and you will see soldiers on one side and kids and people throwing stones on the other, it's kind of seen, these people are the soldiers and police are just keeping these rioters in order. They must be doing something wrong. And without the broader context, that in fact what you're seeing are soldiers occupying a foreign land and trying to suppress a population. Those stories don't make sense. The only way you can make sense of them is, well, the people who are throwing the stones must be doing something wrong. And again, in addition to the news, there's also the movies, cartoons and video games that present Arabs and present Palestinians only as terrorists, only as violent people. And so it's not surprising, actually, that people would think that about the situation, because you only have the way you think about the world is dependent upon the stories that you're told.
Give one of the examples from the films that we can show.
And so we put these stories side by side and show how the American media covered it, and then how the BBC covered it, to show. In fact, you can have very different interpretations of the same events.
Let's show one of the examples. This is a story about 5 Palestinian kids that were killed. So we'll roll that now.
There are other ways of reporting on Palestinian victims. In fact, when you look at the British press, the ways in which the Palestinian victims are dismissed and downplayed in the American media, the ways in which their deaths are justified in American coverage, becomes even more glaring. A really clear example of this is the BBC story on 6 Palestinian kids killed by an Israeli booby trap, and one the next day by Israeli soldiers.
5 small bodies on their way to the grave, carried shoulder high, a martyr's funeral in Gaza for the dead schoolboys. Sources in the Israeli government and security services have admitted they were probably the victims of an Israeli booby trap. Victims who died side by side, 2 sets of brothers and a cousin, all members of one devastated Palestinian family, the Al-Astals. Naeem lost his oldest son and his youngest, who was only 6. Both good boys, he told me, who never gave any trouble. This Israeli minister wants a full inquiry, but claims it wasn't a civilian area.
Civilians are not there.
I stood there.
That's exactly what was
Minister,
stated.
I stood there yesterday. This is an area where children pass to go to school. This is an area where people cultivate. I have stood there and I have seen it. Now, is it appropriate that a roadside bomb should be planted in this place?
That's exactly what will be investigated. That's exactly what will be investigated.
Even as he spoke, Palestinians say another child was killed in Gaza. They claim Israeli forces fired on these stone throwers, killing a 15-year-old called Wael. The army denies it.
So the CNN report says the kids kicked an unexploded tank shell, and the BBC report suggests that it was some kind of a booby trap that was deliberately set there. And I guess we don't know for sure which one's true, but certainly the BBC one gave more context, and that's your point.
It gave more context. It also, the journalist there, acted like a real journalist, actually questioned the Israeli official that was on camera, asking him rather than just letting him get away with saying whatever he wanted to say, actually came back with questions and follow-up. And again, that's something you almost never see in American media.
Now the counter critique that is often made is that there's also no depiction of the profound racism that exists in the Arab media. Certainly much of the Arab media. There's even examples sometimes of textbooks in schools, but certainly you can find it on Arab television that gives this sense of being under siege to Israelis. So what do you make of that? Do you think there's a fair depiction of that in media?
Well, I think different countries have different ways of telling those stories, and those dictators who control the media in those Arab countries have a reason actually to G up the population against Israel. In fact, to deflect attention away from what they're doing themselves. So I'm sure if you look at Arab media, that it's full of these kinds of stereotypes of Israelis. But those media fulfill their own internal function. And so that wasn't the focus of our film. The focus of our film was, okay, what are the stories told in America around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and what explains them.
In the recent conflict or attacks on Gaza by the Israelis, what did you make of the media coverage?
Well, the media coverage, although the film didn't deal with it, but the media coverage fits in perfectly with the patterns that we identify. That is, the media coverage was, it kind of eviscerated history. You wouldn't have known that there was a history in Gaza before, a couple of days before the attack was launched by Israel, and so there's no sense of context. And one of the sections in our films actually is called, violence without a context, or violence in a vacuum, which is all you see is the very end part. And if you cut into history, if you cut into history 2 days ago, then all you're going to see is the end part of a very, very long process. And again, looking at the Gaza coverage, the American media totally bought the line that this was a defensive action by Israel, that they had no option, that Hamas launching the rockets was a provocation that had to be answered. In fact, no mention, no indication that this in fact was the end of a long period in which there was a ceasefire, in which Israel violated the ceasefire, and Hamas finally launches the rockets as the end result, in fact, of a long drawn-out process.
Well,
and again, if you miss that context, and that again, when we talked about, people think that the Palestinians are illegally occupying land in the Middle East. When you miss the context and you only get the last part, you only get the stones that is thrown, you only get the rocket that is launched, you miss out all the history that has led up to it.
Well, you've depicted in the film and in your argument here of a media that presents this kind of picture one-sidedly of an Israel under siege. Certainly in the media here, there's often this sense of the only democracy in the Middle East and surrounded by the sort of fanaticism that would like to bury it. But your film's been accused of being one-sided the other way. The film was purchased by Regio Canada in Quebec, shown, and it came under some critique, and there was an ombudsman report. So in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about the critique of your film. Please join us for the next segment of the interview with Jhally on the Real News Network.